Hi there. This is a review of chapter 21 to 22 of AP US History, also known as the Roaring Twenties to the Great Depression. So first, the 1920s. So before the 1920s, obviously the US was in World War I, and these are some post-war economy typicals, because often the 1920s and 50s are compared, and some things are similar in between for those. And there can be unemployment, and you have to have a transition from wartime to peacetime materials. Remember, they were focusing on wartime materials, but then they had to change it to peacetime. The usuals, and there was inflation too. But because of some of these economic factors, many were able to become more wealthy and afford certain things in the 1920s, but that did lead ultimately to the Great Depression, as we'll find. But the lost generation is a term that writers would use that thought Americans lost their souls in the 1920s individualism, because many started to just focus on themselves rather than other factors in this time. There was 3 different presidents in the 1920s, and all were Republican. That's why I have a red background. First, there was Harding, and Harding was president from 1921 to 1923. So technically, I guess you would say Wilson was a 1920s president, but not really. He died in 1923, so he didn't even get to finish his office, and Calvin Coolidge had to take over. But before we get to that, let's just say what he wanted: a return to normalcy. He did not necessarily like what the progressive presidents did, like Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, what they did in the progressive era. So he was like, let's go back to normal, like in the Gilded Age. And he had a lot of corrupt things he did. He's often named one of the worst presidents. So in my opinion, even though a lot of people don't really like Herbert Hoover, I kind of think that Harding might be possibly the worst of the 3. Coolidge, not quite as bad. And Hoover, as you'll find, the next 2, they kind of just didn't do anything about it. So Coolidge was president in 1923 to 1925 to finish up Harding's term, but also his own term from 1925 to 1929. And he mostly just continued Harding's normalcy policy. He didn't really change much, and it was back to the typical Republican role, as they call it. And Herbert Hoover was president from 1929 to 1933. He also did the same and just continued what was going on, and he just left it as it was and let the economy just do what it did. But he was caught in the beginning of the Great Depression, so it was different for him. Change versus tradition. So these are some things that changed in the 1920s, and here's what happened. Communism. We know that there was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, if you took AP European. And even though that's obviously not American, it still affects America, because the Red Scare was created. The Red Scare kind of faded away after the 1920s, but then it came back when like Stalin came around, and you'll find that out later, and obviously like in the Cold War. And then it's feared that there would be government tyranny and the economy would be just controlled, and everything would be controlled. And they didn't want that to spread to America, because they saw, wow, Russia, that seemed to have had a mostly stable government, was there was a revolution that got rid of that, and it created this new thing called communism that Americans don't like. Prohibition. With the passing of the 18th Amendment, no more alcohol could be used, even though that was during Wilson's time, but still. And then there was bootlegging. That means someone, I mean, if you think about it, what if someone just put a beer bottle in their boot on their leg, the bootleg, to hide it? That might be where that name came from. And there was like Al Capone, and then speakeasies where people would just pretty much break the law and drink anyways. But a lot of people were against prohibition, a lot, and that's what led to the 21st Amendment later on. But we're not talking about that right now. Installment plan and buying on the margin. These were things basically where someone could just sort of like buy now, pay later sort of thing. Well, that was the installment plan. Buying on the margin, they're not the same thing, but buying on the margin is more like, let's invest into this and hopefully we'll get a profit. And if we do, we'll pay back. So they're not the same thing, but both of them led to inflation, wealth gain for now, because as you'll see, this was sort of a false prosperity. Southern racism. Southern racism got worse gradually, and there ended up being African-American migration called the Great Migration to the North and West for more opportunities and to escape this racism, even though it still existed other places too. But there, many African Americans could be free to have their own culture, and that's what the Harlem Renaissance describes. And that's, if this thing wasn't blocking the picture, that's a picture of like jazz, because there was a lot of jazz, and it changes how many viewed African Americans, and in a sense that was a good thing, but it didn't fix everything, obviously. And then immigration. There is a lot of immigration coming from Eastern Europe, so, and Southern. So like especially Italy and Russia. My family I know came during this time from Italy, and there was quota systems, and then there was melting pot. The quota systems limits of people that could go in there. Melting pot, that is just describes all the different cultures that were being mixed together. Nativism, that was a reaction basically just saying they only, basically kind of people only like American born people, American origin people. And some nativism is seen because my family's last name in Italy was, well, on my mom's side was Cagliostro. And then when they came here, they changed it to Colo. They shortened their names, and that's what they did a lot. And then evolution. So there was an idea of evolution from Charles Darwin, and fundamentalism, which is basically just Christianity that just holds the Bible to be very literal, and they did not like evolution at all, and they thought it was not true at all. And so there was a lot of controversy with this, with the biology teacher who, there was a Supreme Court case about that. There was a biology teacher who was trying to teach that, and he lost the case. So obviously fundamentalism was still strong. Wealth gap increase. The richer were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer, sort of, but there was also a middle class that was rising too. And the class struggle was more evident. All right, that was the 1920s. What about the Great Depression? What were the causes of the Great Crash? So the Great Crash is basically the stock market crash that happened on October 29th, 2000. I mean, not 2000. 1929. Over speculation, false prosperity in the stock market, buying on the margin. Oh, I think this is going to be good. I'm really rich. I'm really rich. Wrong. Over speculation. installment plan, buying on the margin, like I just said, inflation, overproduction. Farmers were producing a lot, and as we know in the Gilded Age, things could be transported easily, but wasn't a good thing because that caused inflation. Credit overuse also was a thing. And 1920s president's policies, there were two, in my opinion, this, I can't say this like that it's a fact, but in my opinion, they didn't have as much of a hold on the economy as they should have, which caused it to get out of control. Run on the bank. This was after many banks failed, many withdrew their money from the banks and lost faith in them. That caused many banks to close. That made things worse. As we know, in many panics like this, when people hear there's a shortage of something, they're going to all go there and they're going to make sure that they get what they want. And then that causes the shortage that may have not necessarily been as bad as they thought it was, Rugged individualism, speech condensed. This is a speech by Herbert Hoover, and he explains, and this was, keep in mind, this was before the Great Depression. So this was 1928. And he describes why he thinks his policies should be the way that they were. During World War I, we necessarily turned to the government to solve every difficult economic problem. The government, having absorbed every energy of our people in the war, there was no other solution. And I'll skip a little bit down to, however, justified in wartime, if continued in peacetime, it would destroy not only our American system, but with it, our progress and freedom as well. And then continued, I'll go down to the second paragraph here. And what has been the result of our American system? Our country has become the land of opportunity to those born without inheritance, not merely because of wealth of its resources and industry, but because of the freedom and initiative and enterprise. Russia has natural resources equal to ours, but she has not had the blessings of 150 years of our form of government and social system. So basically saying, even though some people might think resources are why America is successful, it's because of the freedom of a free market, a free economy without government control. And he says that was needed during World War I in those circumstances, which Wilson did, but now not anymore. Well, apparently that wasn't exactly right, as we'll see. But a question would be, and these are just example questions so that you would understand how you would want to answer that if you were given an SAQ or something. How does rugged individualism reconcile with Hoover's policies during the early stages of the Great Depression? His speech describes that the past American successes deeply contrast those of nations with equivalent resources to the concepts of individual freedoms and non-government regulated markets. He argues that although it was necessary to switch to a government-managed economy during World War I, it is no longer. Nevertheless, it foreshadows Hoover's Harding-like normalcy concepts, such as the permission of buying on the margin, which led to over-speculation. Consequently, Great Crash and Depression occurred, resulting in a near opposite approach from the next president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And answer the following now. And these are 4 other ones, examples of things that you might want to answer. And I'll just say it kind of concisely, but you should probably say more than what I say. It's just for the sake of this video time. Sorry. Describe Hoover's point of view about government involvement in the economy. Well, he doesn't like it necessarily. He doesn't necessarily think that it should go completely laissez-faire, but he thinks that too much control is not a good thing. Was his point of view a continuation or departure from the traditional government regulations idea? I would say continuation, because if you know, pretty much let's see. And in post-Civil War times, up until the Progressive era, there was just pretty much a whole bunch of Republican presidents, mostly, except for like ones here and there, like Grover Cleveland, that pretty much all did the same thing. And that resulted in the problems of the Gilded Age that we've already talked about. And yeah, so I would say it's a continuation. What are typical responses to his policies? Well, not everyone agreed with him. There was the bonus army, is what it was called, of World War I veterans who were promised money, but they wanted to get it already. So they were marching, and it made Hoover look bad. Should he be blamed for the Great Depression? This is a controversial question, but my opinion, I say yes. I don't put all the blame on him, but I think it's collective, and I think that he could have done more, that he could have figured out that where the economy was going, even though it was seemingly successful, that couldn't lead anywhere good with the state of the economy and stock markets and that. So there you go. New Deal. Bye-bye Hoover. He definitely loses in 1932. And then there's FDR, who came in with the New Deal. Roosevelt, like his sort of uncle Theodore, I forget how they're related, but they are both Roosevelts. I think like Eleanor Roosevelt, which was FDR's wife, her uncle was Theodore. So like uncle-in-law, if that's even a thing. But he had 3 R's like the other one too. His 3 R's were reform, recovery, and relief. He's like reform, change stuff, recovery, and relief, get things back to normal. And that just says 32 because he was elected in 1932 and he was president number 32. Reacting to criticism. FDR had criticism too, and people like Francis Townshend criticized the New Deal. Townshend, sorry if I'm not saying that right, Townshend stated that it was too hard on the elderly. Result, Social Security Act, which provided benefits for the elderly and insurance to the disadvantaged. So that's something that's good about FDR, because it wasn't like people were like, I don't like this, and he's just like, too bad. At least he did something to try to accommodate to what was needed. Question and answer. Describe one response to the New Deal. Here's one response, and in this case, it's a negative response. Within a citizen's letter to Senator Robert Wagner, that's irrelevant, but just focus on what this person says. A negative response is displayed towards the New Deal. FDR's ideas and acts are claimed to be socialist and implicitly devastating to the American freedom. Furthermore, the citizen states that the perceived belief of many is a false reality, which proves that there was critical opposition to the New Deal. And that's sort of kind of like what Hoover said in his rugged individualism. Too much control in the economy means socialists, communists, not good. That's what some people thought. And to an extent, that could be true, but there's got to be a balance. That's a key thing. And that's it. So that's not obviously all you need to know. There's key people and key terms and New Deals. Like, I thought I had a slide on here that said specific New Deals, or I mean, New Deal programs like the CCC and WPA. Sorry that I don't, but you would need to know those. But this was just a kind of general review, so you understand the concepts, but know your vocab too, and how you could apply it. This was more about how you could apply things than the vocab, but that'll be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.